Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 8 of Design of Play, where we go through and play through different landmark important games in gaming's history. I play them on stream and then spend a few weeks researching the game. And then we have a discussion where we talk about the history of the IP, the development of that game in the IP, the final results that we got for the game, the processes and the decisions and changes behind the development process. To get the final result, whether it's game mechanics, story progression, or what have you. We talk about the games that came out around the time where it's released because those can potentially impact decisions when making the game. We talk about what's influential or what was groundbreaking about the game, and finally, we break it down what I believe the game, what the industry can learn from the game. Today, we will be talking about Spec Ops: The Line. This was a military shooter that pretty much played on expectations into the military shooter genre and then completely veered off on a different path, not into a completely different genre, but venturing into different stories and viewpoints that the game, that genre has to tell, but no one had ever gone in and done themselves. So, talk about Spec Ops: The Line. But first, I do want to talk about a couple things first before we actually get into the discussion. First, I want to say, first and foremost, if you have not played the game, please consider playing the game before you watch this. The game is not incredibly long. It's about 6 or 7 hours for most people, and some people can argue or feel like it's not worth the money for a $6 or $7 hour experience, but I promise you it is absolutely worth the experience. I feel like everyone has that short list of games that they would like to wipe their memories clean of and be able to re-experience it for the first time anew. That this game is probably top of the list for games I would like to do for that. I knew quite a bit about going into the game, and I was still quite surprised by how they approach some things, and I really wish I could have gone into this completely blind. If you have not played the game and you are moderately interested in playing the game after anything that I've said thus far, please turn off the video, please go play the game, and then come back and then watch the video, because there is simply no way to have a discussion about the content of the game and what's important about it without spoiling everything about it. So, that's my first forewarning. The other thing I do want to say is I'd like to thank Extra Credits. Extra Credits was the YouTube channel that did turn me on to this game in the first place. They were the ones who got me to know about it at all, and I probably would not have played it or had this discussion if it were not for them. So thank you very much to those individuals. So, next thing I want to talk about real quick is I'm sorry that this upload has taken so long. This discussion took so long to have after our previous video. It has been a absolutely ridiculous couple of weeks. Tiny has been sick, and that has definitely messed with my schedule quite a little bit, and I'm definitely a creature of habit, so that kind of killed my motivation and drive to get these videos done. But luckily Tiny is feeling better. She has gone back to work, so things have gone back on the right track again, as well as I have also been in the process of trying to get a new job, and that has kind of been taking up some of my time and been a bit of a distraction. And if I do end up getting the job, the frequency and consistency of these discussions will probably shift as well. They could become a monthly thing because I would be spending more time at work. They could become a more consistent bi-weekly thing because when I come home from work, I don't have enough energy and time to stream, but I would definitely have, 3-hour window where I could just chill and research and, gather information to present into a discussion. So who knows? Things could possibly change if I end up getting the job. And the last reason why this took so long is there's just a lot of different things about this game, so much different information that was very, very difficult to get my thoughts assembled in a way for this discussion. Well, once we actually get into the discussion, I'm sure that'll be a little more clear. But thank you, everyone, for being so patient with how long this discussion has actually taken to get ready and actually present to you guys. But here we are. So let's talk about Spec Ops: The Line. So Spec Ops: The Line is a game that was released June 26 back in 2012, and this was a game that was published by 2K. 2K, as many people will know, are the ones who publish a lot of the different 2K sports games, but they also publish the BioShock series, one of the games I would like to, in this series, go back and play and discuss at some point. They have also published the I meant to say they published the Borderlands series, which I plan on having a discussion in the future. They have published the BioShock series, which we've already had 2 discussions about in the past. They just published the Civilization series, which I was very surprised about. I had no idea. And they have published the Duke Nukem series, for better or for worse. And they've also published the original Prey IP. So that's just a couple noteworthy IPs and titles that they've released. They are pretty well known. They've got quite a different fingers into quite a different pies in the industry. And actually, the whole thing with 2K is kind of interesting in its own right, because they are actually, usually publishers are some of the bigger parts of the industry, and they tend to not be owned. In most cases, they usually are standalone things. However, 2K is owned by Take-Two Interactive, who owns multiple different publishers. They own Rockstar, which obviously is known for making the Grand Theft Auto series, the Red Dead Redemption series, and Bully series. And then they also own, I actually am drawing a blank on the other name, but a team that has published the Kerbal Space Program series. So Take-Two is part of a very, very large sector of the video game industry in terms of publishing, and Spec Ops was published by them. Spec Ops was developed by a group called Jaeger Entertainment, and this is a German studio that's located in Berlin, and they have a fairly short list of releases. One of the games is called Jaeger, I guess self-titled. This is a flight simulator with horribly 2000s writing. This game came out in 2003. Very, very 2003 writing and dialogue. And you basically just pilot like a small, agile, personal ship. The best way I could probably summarize it or compare it to would be like those free roam levels in Star Fox 64, however, with much tighter controls. That's pretty much the majority of the gameplay available in it. The next game that they made was Spec Ops Online, which is the game we will be discussing today. And they were originally supposed to be the developer for Dead Island 2, actually, before they had started working on developing the game, and then they were dropped by the publisher for creative differences. And apparently the respective visions for the game kind of fell out of alignment 3 years after the development had started, which is kind of a rough amount of time to be working on a game before finally being dropped. And that's partially and probably why Dead Island has still not been released to this day, and why it's been in this development hell. So after Spec Ops Online, they made a game called Dreadnought, which was another flight simulator. However, this one was for humongous, giant ships. The first one, Jaeger, was much more small personal ships, comparable to an R-Wing from Star Fox 64. These were much more large, giant ships. Probably, like to emphasize it, everything moves a lot slower during the combat itself, to emphasize just the massive size to it. This is a game that's much more specific type of audience, almost kind of like a sim type of game. So definitely not for everyone. What's up, Hermes? Yeah, I know a lot of people are once they get to a certain point. So the last game that Jaeger has worked on is a game called The Cycle. And I do want to take a second to talk about this one as well, because when Fall Guys came out, I remember being very excited and being very vocal about how excited I was about it, because the Battle Royale genre is something that's kind of been beaten to death, but only beaten to death in one genre specifically. It's always been about drop into a giant area, have 100 people gunning each other down, and one person left standing. And I've always thought the idea of 100 people or a large amount of people dropping into an area with the last person standing in some way was always an awesome idea, but it just seemed that no one was willing to try out different genres, probably because it would be an expensive endeavor, and it's a game that requires an audience to have, so it's a lot more risky to try different things. However, with The Cycle, they have tried something different. The Cycle is made by Jaeger, and it's by definition a BR, because there are 20 people dropping into one map. And you can kill each other with guns. However, the main goal of the game is to do objectives throughout the location. There's like hostile and living creatures in the environment where you have to try to mine certain resources while fending off the wildlife in the area. There's trains where you have to take command of, and while riding upon it, you get certain points. And then when it docks in certain locations and unlocks and unloads, you get certain points. It's and of course during this whole time there's the PvP element where people try to kill and shoot each other. But in the end, it's not necessarily about the last person standing. It's about how many points you've accrued by doing different objectives in the game. And it looked really, really cool. So I definitely want to shout out a cool take on the BR genre, because no one seems to be willing to try to take different chances with different styles or approaches to how to do that. I guess is a genre. I guess we could describe BR as a genre. So I definitely wanted to shout that out because they've been doing a great job. So that's a free-to-play game, and that's the entire rap sheet of what Jaeger has developed. Well, they have been around since 2003. They've only made 4 games. One of them, which was in development hell, Dead Island 2, which got canceled. Spec Ops, which took about, I believe, 5 years to develop. Dreadnought probably had a simple development cycle, and then The Cycle, the new game, is a free-to-play game that kind of has more longevity to it, so that's kept them busy. It's kind of crazy. They've been around for 17 plus years with 5 games fully released, but they seem to be doing pretty good, so good for them. Now, before Spec Ops The Line, there were many Spec Ops games that came out before this one. However, they were games that were released in the late 90s and the early 2000s, and they were generally met with poor sales and negative review scores, so the series was put on hold after a certain amount of time. I tried looking in to get any kind of basic information about the Spec Ops games, but they seemed just incredibly generic military shooters in the older days. I would probably have to go through and play most of them to get some kind of basic understanding, and I was not about to put myself for the discussion of this game. I was not going to force myself to play a bunch of old generic 90s military shooters that were reviewed and viewed as not great games. So sue me. So that's just a little bit of background info on Spec Ops The Line. Spec Ops. Oh, I forgot to. I forgot I had images to coincide with the different games. Man, oh well. But that is Spec Ops The Line, and a little bit of the IP behind it in the early stages. So let's talk about Spec Ops The Line itself and how it started to take shape. So back in 2003, 2K announced that Rockstar would actually be working on the next Spec Ops game. Sorry. There we go. Rockstar would be working on the next Spec Ops game, and that was announced in 2003, but then in 2004 it was announced that the game had actually been canceled, and that instead Rockstar would be working on Bully. So the game had been in development for less than a year at that point, and afterwards 2K started approaching different studios, asking them for different studios to make their own type of pitch for Spec Ops The Line. What's up, Andy? 2K was, well, they were looking for other people to make pitches for what they could do with the IP and different ideas they could do. 2K still had the idea that they wanted to kind of reinvent and reboot this series, probably to distance themselves from the earlier games and the negative reviews or the middling reviews that the series had garnered up until that point, to just basically break away from that perception. Corey Davis was someone who was approached by 2K, and this is the man that would eventually become the game's lead designer, and asked him for a pitch, and his pitch was a sci-fi type of game that did take place in Dubai, but with more futuristic soldiers, and it was eventually rejected. It's not a game I played or particularly heard of, so I will say this again. This game is fantastic. This game is wonderful. The less you know about this game, the absolute better. This is a game that hopes that you go into it expecting it to be a regular generic Call of Duty clone. I would say again, if you've not played the game and you are even moderately interested in playing a game that completely pulls the rug out from under you, I would suggest turning away from the discussion right now, playing the game yourself and coming back and watching afterwards. The game is not incredibly long. It's about 7 hours. I believe it's $30, so it can be kind of a hard sell to convince someone to drop $30 on like a 7-hour game, but I do promise you it is a fantastic game, a game that if I had the opportunity, I would wipe my memory of it and play it all over again, brand new, with no previous understandings or no about it. It's great. But Corey Davis pitched a sci-fi game, and it was a game that would take place in Dubai with futuristic soldiers. However, that was rejected. So 2K then took the IP, shopped around, looked to different developers, and could not really find anything that I guess really resonated with them or something that they were happy with. So 2 years later, 2K approached Davis again to talk to him about the original pitch that he had given. But they brought some new, slightly different ideas to the party. ideas that made it a little more dark and mature, and these ideas in this discussion eventually led to the culmination that would become Spec Ops: The Line. So the original idea came from the idea of wanting to make a game where the forces of nature would force the players to make decisions. Decisions that the player never thought that they would ever have to make. And they would basically put the players into scenarios where bad things could happen to good people. And in this list of good people, they wouldn't necessarily include the player themselves. And also in terms of real life inspirations for the story, we have the story of the army of Camses. I think that's how you pronounce his name. Quick little history lesson. Camses was a Persian king that back in the year of 525 BC sent an army of 50,000 soldiers from the city of Luxor across the Egyptian desert to the city of Siwa because an oracle that lived there rejected his claim to the Egyptian throne. So Camses was a Persian king who laid claim to the Egyptian throne. However, a oracle who lived in another city across the Egyptian desert said, nah, you don't own that. I see otherwise. You are not the king. So he sent an army across the desert to go and take over or convince him to say otherwise. According to ancient Greek historian Herodotus, the army traveled for 7 days and then completely vanished without a trace, believing to have been enveloped by a massive sandstorm and then perished. The knowledge of this event, compounded with real-life experiences that the writers had with sandstorms themselves, let them to understand the true power of sandstorms and how quickly they can roll in. The devs also referenced the Dust Bowl as other real-life inspirations for sandstorms. The Dust Bowl, or the Dirty 30s, as it's sometimes referred to, was a time where Middle America was completely ravaged by sandstorms for nearly a decade. They also referred to the Middle East, which is still regularly hit by sandstorms in current days. So the mixture of just real-life events from themselves, because I believe two of the different writers lived in Texas and had dealt with sandstorms. Their understanding and of the Dust Bowl in America, current times in the Middle East. One of the writers spent quite a bit of time in Dubai himself and experienced sandstorms there. And apparently one of the writers, when catching ear about the army of Camses, because there was right before the release or the start period of the development for this game, there was a massive update in the mystery of the army of Camses, because while the 50,000 soldiers had gone missing, two archaeologists had been able to pinpoint a general location where the army might have gone and was able to find quite a large deposit of skeletons underneath the sand. And this was breaking news in the architectural world, that the lost army of Camses, 50,000 soldiers, had finally been understood as to what had happened to them, and the idea that a army could be swallowed up by a sandstorm and just completely disappear without a trace was a huge part of influence for the game. One of the writers at one point in their interviews, I do want to say, made it clear that the emphasis on sandstorms was not an attempt to make a statement on climate change. That wasn't their goal for the game. It started off more as a metaphor for what the characters were going through, that the sandstorm strips the characters and the city down to the bone to expose who they are and what's really happening with them in there. The architectural world. You know what I mean. I'm not talking about your dirty 30s. What's up? How you doing? So, the foundation of the game's story became one about sandstorms swallowing up massive cities and an entire army. This itself was a very unique premise to the gaming medium. We have I'm sure a lot of people make the comparison to BioShock as a city that was underwater, and there definitely is comparisons there. However, one that was completely consumed by sand is definitely a little bit different, especially considering this was a modern-day, real-life city that was there one day and then gone the next, as opposed to one built underwater. This foundation would lead to a story that would force the players to confront the harsh realities of war and violence, also something that really hadn't been touched on in shooters. Walt Williams, which is one of the game's writers, wasn't a huge fan of military shooters that much. He had come from a military family himself and was very briefly in the military. He had a brother who was deployed 2 times and a close friend who was deployed 4 times. whenever he saw any of them come back from deployment, he saw little differences in them that he felt military shooters really didn't address or reflect that well. He didn't think that they were good representations of what people in the Army actually experienced and went through. He was saying, I believe he said, you don't go over like Captain America and come back a hero because you've killed everyone, which is generally how a lot of military shooters in modern day tend to frame it. Williams felt that Hollywood had gone through their movement where they made movies that didn't romanticize war and every aspect of it, and he felt that gaming was ripe for the picking to do that as well. So when they actually got into the development stage and they started developing the characters, their goal was to make the main character as average as possible. The goal was to make him as average as possible so that players could more easily relate to them and put themselves in the place of the player. They also wanted him to be a blank slate in terms of personality so that he could more noticeably and easily evolve as the game progressed forward. This was obviously to show as strongly as possible the psychological traumas that he had to go through with all the horrible events that take place during the game. But upon, when you're trying to make him as a blank slate as possible, as bland as possible, it can be a little bit difficult to do, because while that does make him relatable, at the same time they still have to make a soldier who has gone through special ops training, can do all the crazy things that he can do. So it was a very difficult balance for them to work with. The game being in third person made creating the character more difficult in certain aspects, but also more easier in other aspects. So the game is Kuga. Thank you for the support. The game is meant to be Walker's journey and how he changes, but it's also supposed to be the player's journey themselves. And just like Walker, as he changes as the game goes on, the player is supposed to change as well. It's not just supposed to be the game or the fictional character as in the game. While you're physically the player seeing Walker walk and move in third person in the game, it might be harder for the player to project themselves onto the player as onto Walker, as opposed to just a first person perspective. But at the same time, when they see it in third person, they can see his body language and everything he does. They can physically see everything becoming, going from a more poised and confident type of mannerisms to more erratic and aggressive. And this can lead to a type of circular projection between both the main character as well as the players. So the player makes a choice, they make the choices for Walker, and that causes his mental state to deteriorate. Walker's mental state starts to decline and deteriorate, and he becomes visibly less collected as a soldier. The player picks up on these slight, minute changes and expects Walker, as a result, to make more dramatic and erratic decisions. And hopefully, the player also feels bad at seeing the results of their actions manifested in Walker. So, you see him physically, and then you make the choices, and you see him start to break down. So the player expects him to continue to do these types of things, and it kind of builds upon itself and just builds into a cycle. And hopefully the goal is to try to make the player feel bad as these take place, as the events of the game unfold. Also, one of the other results of the game being in third person was they decided to add cutscenes. The debate about cutscenes is still one that happens today, but was much more contentious around the time of the release of Spec Ops The Line. You have games moving into 3D and they have much stronger hardware. One of the huge benefits of that is that they can render much better cutscenes, and developers had gone gung-ho for a little while, but the problem then becomes it's no longer a video game, you're just simply watching a movie. That it's hard to separate those two from each other. Obviously, cutscenes can be very strong tools for conveying story and emotions and much more, but it becomes very difficult to find the line of when it's needed to be done, when it adds to the experience and when it takes it away. And that was a very, very hot debate topic at the time. And the team was very much against cutscenes when making the game, but they decided, and so they decided to try not to use cutscenes as much as possible during the development of the game, if they didn't have to. But they also realized that they could use it to a much greater advantage in the game in certain scenes because the game is third person, because the players could see Walker and become more familiar with him and his stature and his emotions and his demeanor and how he held himself on the battlefield. Having these cutscenes show off these more taxing moments could have a much stronger impact on the story if they're constantly seeing him as from, the third person perspective, as opposed to, again, being in first person perspective, where you just look at his eyes. Also, the cutscenes could more easily show off the mental breakdown much more clearly, since the cutscenes could be crafted to show more of what the devs wanted specifically during those times. So, that's most of what I could gather about the early development phase of how Spec Ops started to take shape, why we got Walker the design that we did, why they decided to do it in third person, why they've decided to do sand, and why they did it in the setting, how the game came into the hands of Jaeger, and everything like that. So we are going to then move on from Spec Ops and how it took shape into, now we're going to talk about the games that came out about around the time of the release of Spec Ops before we actually get into the final release of Spec Ops. And the reason why I like to talk about the games that came out around the time of Spec Ops release is because games that are huge and popular at the time can definitely be influential on another game's development decisions. If they see something being more popular, more successful, it can definitely influence them. But the other thing is, it can influence how successful the game could be when you look at the lineup of games. The average consumer, the average gamer, only has a set amount of money that they can spend each year on games, and if they have enough money to buy 2, maybe 3 games, it can definitely be a huge factor on whether they purchase these games or not. And that's not just specifically for shooters themselves. There are many people who like to play different genres of games. There are people who like to play shooters as well as Nintendo games. So looking at the year of releases, we can kind of gather an understanding of why maybe the game sold as well as it did, or maybe as well as or as bad as it did, and so on. So I like to look at these releases around the time. So let's do that for Spec Ops. Now, Spec Ops released again in June, I believe. Yes, it released in June 26 of 2012. So I like to look at the 6 months before and the 6 months after release of a game. This happens to work out since June is smack dab in the middle. So this is pretty much all of the games that released in 2012. So leading up to the release of Spec Ops The Line, there were a couple of competitors. We had Mass Effect 3 and Max Payne 3 were coming out, both shooters. Mass Effect definitely has a huge emphasis on story, however, it is still a shooter, so I'm sure there was quite a bit of overlay. And I decided to put Resident Evil Revelations into there. The Resident Evil franchise is pretty expansive. There are tons of different games in the series and tons of different spin-offs. Based on my light researching I could find into it, it seemed like a game that was pretty well received and had quite a bit of hype around it, and has a lot of maybe not similar shooter mechanics, because Spec Ops has more squad-based, but still a shooter in that respect. So in terms of direct competitors, Spec Ops had a couple games. In terms of non-competitors, games that aren't exactly directly the type of genre as Spec Ops, there was still quite a bit that came out in the year 2012. So we had Soul Calibur 5 come out. We had the Twisted Metal reboot came out. I completely forgot about that. I remember when that was announced, I was super hyped about it, and I just never really saw anything about it again. Dear Esther, the indie darling, came out. Mario Party 9 came out, the start of the decline of that series. Journey, also another huge indie game, came out at that time. Kid Icarus Uprising, the revitalization of the Kid Icarus IP for like the first time in like 25, 30 years at that time. Skullgirls, I had no idea, also came out in 2012. I guess this was the original origin point of the Skullgirls IP. We had Xenoblade Chronicles X had its release in North America. Fez, the fantastic indie game, came out. We had the first episode of The Walking Dead series from the oh gosh, I'm drawing a blank, the studio that closed down, Telltale. There it is. The first Telltale Walking Dead game came out. SCP Containment Breach. I had no idea this game went back as far as it did, but the game that was based on the creepypasta wiki community that apparently made their game came out in 2012. Prototype 2, I will still stand and die by this IP. I love Prototype. That had its release. Diablo 3 came out in 2012. Plague Inc. broke out on mobile. We had Pokemon Conquest. And then Civilization 5 came out. Yes, we will be getting into, there is more games that came out. So these were the 6 months leading up to the release of, not Black Ops. This was the 6 months leading up to Spec Ops: The Line. As for the 6 months after Spec Ops: The Line, we'll go back and look at some games that were competitors. We had Sleeping Dogs, the Grand Theft Auto type of competitor game, came out. We had Borderlands 2, the continuation of the looter shooter genre. Wondering if this is right. Now I'm actually thinking that this is a mistake. There's no way that this is. Hold on. I know this is very professional, but I'm feeling like I forgot to put a subtitle on which one specifically this is. Yeah, no, that's definitely not right. Assassin's Creed. I apparently forgot to put the which Assassin's Creed it was specifically. I'm gonna say there's no way Assassin's Creed came out in 2012. I don't believe that. Assassin's Creed 3. That's what it was. Assassin's Creed 3 came out. I'm like, there's absolutely no way I just put Assassin's Creed. I forgot to put 3 at the end. So, sorry. Assassin's Creed 3 came out within 6 months after Spec Ops: The Line. Halo 4 was released. We had Call of Duty Black Ops 2, probably one of the biggest competitors that they had to deal with. And then Far Cry 3 as well was another competitor. These were games that came out within the 6 months after Spec Ops, and there was quite a bit of competition in this case when it comes to shooters or games that have similar types of feels, whether it's just directly military shooters like Call of Duty, or games that are fairly similar that have a lot in common like Halo 4, Far Cry 3, or Borderlands 2, or games that definitely have an emphasis on shooter that could definitely, I don't want to say leech off the competition, but definitely draws in some people, like for example Sleeping Dogs, and even some parts of Assassin's Creed 3, because I think they had the gun in at that point. As for the 6 months that came after the release of Spec Ops: The Line, we had some more pretty big games. This was a big, good year for Nintendo. We had New Super Mario Bros. 2. This is the one that came out for the 3DS. This is the coin one where you just grab buttloads of coins everywhere. FTL, Faster Than Light, finally came out, one of the Kickstarter games. Pokemon Black 2 and White 2 was released. We had Dishonored, the surprise hit that came out of nowhere. I remember that game came out, and I saw someone talking about it online like 2 days after it came out and how it was so great, and I said, screw it. After I watched the trailer, I'm like, that seems good. I'm going to grab it, and I tried to go to GameStop, and they're like, yeah, no, this is sold out. We were like stocked up like crazy on the day of release, and then within the next 48 hours we all sold out, and there were like 3 other GameStops in the area that had the same issue. So that kind of came out of nowhere and did pretty well. Hotline Miami came out. Zero Escape VLR, if you are into murder mysteries, if you are into puzzle mystery games, Zero Escape series is fantastic. VLR came out in 2012. Unfortunately, Paper Mario Sticker Star came out. We had Thomas Was Alone, a wildly successful indie game that still gets talked about regularly to this day, came out, and I do need to play that game. New Super Mario Bros. U came out. Basically, the Wii U was released, so we had quite a few games that came out for the Wii U during this time. And then, of course, the most important game, Hatoful Boyfriend. So 2012 was a very, very big year, and it wasn't just 2012. If we go back just a little bit more, if we go into the previous year, I think it was actually in October. So, Spec Ops came out in June, and I covered the 6 months before and after, so pretty much all of 2012. I believe in October, November, and December of 2011, we had Uncharted 3, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3, and Battlefield 3 come out. So military shooters were all the rage, and there was a lot of stiff competition to go up against. Yeah, Hatoful Boyfriend was in 2012. What's up, Madbat? And what's up, Treble? Yeah, unfortunately, the starting decline of the Paper Mario series was in November 2011. Yep, there we go. And the last 3 months before 2012, Because, I mean, that's the big holiday season. The big holiday season. I mean, that's why right now it's November 10th right now. We still have all these huge games that are be coming out in the next 2 months because that's the holiday season. That's when games try to get their IPs and their releases out the door so that they can be there for the big holiday sales for Black Friday and everything like that. 11/11. Oh, Skyrim was in that window as well. Interesting. I don't imagine, I mean, again, still a major release, still a very big release. And again, if people only have $100, $120 a year to spend on video games, Skyrim was a huge game. And even if it's not directly in competition as a shooter, if, you know, not everyone who plays shooters only plays shooters, they have a limited amount of funds that they could spend. Skyrim being as big as it was could definitely be a competitor in that sense for, you know, maybe people don't buy it because they rather buy Skyrim and Call of Duty at that point. So yeah, 2012 was a big year, and right before 2012, that last holiday season had some pretty major releases too. Some directly as competition, some not so much. Being on the Wii U and past history with Sticker Star, I'm going to have, so the plan is I do want to do all the Paper Mario, the last 3 Paper Mario games, because I know the first 2 very, very well. I plan on playing the other 3 Paper Mario games and then having discussions about those as well. So we will have full-fledged discussions on the Paper Mario games, the 3 ones, the 3 most recent releases, where I will have some of them I will have played for the first time so I can actually be more informed about the discussion. Some of them I will have played again recently, so I will be much more informed about the discussion. I will actually be able to research and look at some information about the background or history or development of the game so we can have tons of discussion on that. I love talking about Paper Mario on my stream, but for the actual discussion, I do want to kind of try to focus on Paper Mario, or do want to focus on Spec Ops itself, because I will go on a tangent for quite a while when discussing Paper Mario. This is my birthday, and I had the day off of school. My grandpa took me to GameStop to get DSi points card, and the place was just packed. Oh, really? Yeah, I remember when I heard the news of the Paper Mario Sticker Star coming for DS, I was excited. I was very, very excited for another Paper Mario game. And I saw it was turn-based combat again, so I was also very, very excited. So I just immediately bought the game without a second thought and was very, very disappointed. That was probably my first introduction to understanding that games, you really do need to do some research and have some form of skepticism on the game before purchasing it. And you can't just buy it because it's an IP that, you know, you like. Also, no, Hatoful Boyfriend was not 2011. Sorry, that was 2012. Late 2012. My apologies. All right. So we've gone through. We have discussed the background about who it is that's making Spec Ops Line Jaeger. We've talked about a little bit of the early development points of the game, how we came to the decision on a military shooter that pulls the rug out from underneath you. We talked about the games that came out around the release of Spec Ops. So now let's actually talk about Spec Ops itself, the final product. So Spec Ops first, let's just get right into talking about some of the very basic gameplay elements that the game had. It is your very typical basic third-person cover-based shooter with simple squad mechanics. It has a third-person view, so you can see your character and everything around you at all times. At the same time, it has a cover-based system that's very common in third-person shooters, because again, it's in third person. It's very common in third-person shooters because you can take cover behind a certain object, but also still be able to see everything around you. The 3 main characters make up a small squad, and as the player, you have the ability to give the other 2 players priority targets to shoot at. And when your squad mate is downed, you must rush over to revive them. You can also send one of your other teammates to go and revive them themselves. Those are the basic third-person cover-based shooting mechanics about it. In this game, though, sand plays a very, very large part in the gameplay experience. Due to its location, its setting in general, as well as the odd circumstances that the setting gives you, sand is absolutely everywhere in this game. You can shoot windows to let cascades of sand bury opponents beneath them. You can shoot windows above them to drop some sand and scatter the enemies that are behind cover to scare them out of cover. Outside, when you're on battlefields, You can throw grenades that when they explode in the sand, it creates a dust cloud that pops up and obscures and distracts the enemies so they can't see you, they can't shoot you, and in most cases they will run out of cover. There are major set piece moments where cataclysmic sandstorms rush in, heavily obfuscating the vision and bombarding the player with loud wind, and it just creates for these insanely stressful experiences, as seen in the image to the left over here. You'll be fighting in a battlefield one moment, and all of a sudden you have these bright, this dark red sand come in and make it so it's very difficult to see far in front of you. You have this loud wind, so it's just constantly battering your ears, and you have to continue to the next sequence. Apparently, during the development of this game, they had used Bioshock as an influence in some ways, where with Bioshock, as we talked before, water was everywhere in that game. Water was absolutely everywhere. And they try to remind you that water is everywhere in the game. And they do the exact same thing with Spec Ops The Line, where there are long segments where you're just traveling out on sand dunes. There are squad mates who will constantly remind you to shoot out windows to let the sand in. Some segments aren't even possible to move through until you shoot out the windows and allow these different cascades of sand to come in. There's sand regularly trickling down into the glass cracks. You have these large set pieces. The game makes sure not to let you forget about the fact that there is sand absolutely everywhere. A clip would be nice to show in the description. A clip could be nice. Absolutely. I don't deny that. But I also think that as it is right now, I think images work just as fine. Images work great and easy to move on to the next thing. I feel images for these discussions can be possibly a little bit distracting, which is why I do have animated backgrounds, but they move very, very lightly as to not distract too much. I thought about doing clips, but one, it is way more time consuming than doing images, but also I feel like it can be kind of distracting. But anyway, where were we? Oh, that's right. So those are the basic mechanics of the game. Like I said, it is a fairly generic first-person shooter. Nothing really wild in that regard. We'll talk more about the shooter mechanics for the game. But next we are going to move on to the characters. And the characters, the first one to talk about is Captain Martin Walker. This is the protagonist. This is the character that you play yourself. He is the leader of Delta Force, and he is in charge of his squad mates, Staff Sergeant John Lugo and First Lieutenant Alfonso Adams. As said before, he is very middle of the road. He is a blank slate character who, in every chance he can be, tries to just focus entirely on the mission. He doesn't have a whole lot of personality that is developed, unless it is to develop to further emphasize the fact that his priority is the mission and going through and completing what it is that he came here for. Next we have Conrad. Conrad is the antagonist of the game. He is in charge of the 33rd Battalion. Conrad is mentioned as, he's regularly referred to as the one in charge of the city, and he is referred to in the game by other characters occasionally. Like there are certain moments where you find like little effigies of him, where survivors in the city will create little effigies for him. While he is referenced and talked about a lot in the game, he is only seen for the first time and actually has some sort of communication with the player after Walker does what he does for the white phosphorus scene. So that's important to note. And the reason why it's important is because it's revealed at the end of the game that he has actually committed suicide. Walker has actually been dead the entire time, and he committed suicide shortly after the broadcast at the very beginning of the game that it is heard. He is the main goal and point of his character is he is the final test for Walker and the player. They need to admit that they were never forced to do anything that happened in the game or in Dubai, and that everything that occurred in the game was of their own choosing. That is the main final point of Conrad as a character. So after Conrad, we have John Lugo. He is the marksman of Delta Squad as well as the medic. His personality, he is very much a jokester, very lighthearted. Any kind of very grim or dark scenarios, he tends to try to make light or a joke of it. And he ends up dying when a helicopter crashes with Delta Squad in it. And while they all survive the landing, Lugo lands in a city, or he lands nearby in a city where angry mobsters and angry people, civilians who are angry at the Americans for causing the destruction that they did, see this as a chance to get back at him, and they lynch him in the middle of the city. So after John Lugo, the last one we have is Alfonso Adams. I could not find a good picture for him for any reason. I don't know why. This was the best resolution image I could find. And he looks very angry, which he is very angry through most of the game. But then again, everyone else is. He is the heavy gunner of Delta Squad. He is the teammate who trusts Walker's judgment the most, more than anyone else in the group. However, he eventually turns on Walker and blames him as being the cause of the death of Lugo. Eventually, Alfonso Adams as well dies when Walker wants to surrender and allow the opposition to capture them in hopes that he can then break free after they've captured them, taken them closer to Conrad, and so that he could break free and then go see him face to face. Alfonso was very, very angry at the thought of this and forces Walker to continue by basically being a distraction, and Alfonso Adams dies in a blaze of war. So those are pretty much the major main characters that you will encounter in the game. So now that we've covered the basic mechanics and most of the major characters we'll encounter in the game, let's talk about the big, most important thing and the main draw about Spec Ops: The Line, and that would be the story. So the main story, the main idea, the setting is that Dubai is surrounded by a massive sandstorm that's completely rendered the city a no man's land. No one is able to get in or out of the city. Radio signals either cannot get past the storm or cannot get very far outside of the storm. And the game starts where, for a very brief window, a radio signal does get out of the sandstorm. And Lieutenant Colonel Conrad sends out a message where he says the evacuation that he had conducted in the city was a failure and that the death toll was far too many to count. Walker gets word of this and volunteers, him and his squad, to go get Conrad and the men that were trapped in there to get them out of Dubai. After that is basically the setup for the game, and everything that follows and precedes after that is the actual events of the gameplay itself. The 33rd Battalion themselves is a faction of the U.S. military that's under Conrad's control. And they went into Dubai to rescue the civilians after the sandstorm itself had started to roll in. Due to extreme circumstances of everything going on in the city, the 33rd set up a temporary military government to establish order while a plan for evacuation of the city was made. After the attempted evacuation failed, many of the 33rd faction actually rebelled against Conrad, leading to a civil war between these two halves, and the citizens of Dubai were basically caught in the crossfire. So we have the tensions between the two factions. We have the stress from the environment itself with the sandstorms. We have regret from the failed evacuation. We have anxiety from CIA insurgents. CIA go in to try to figure out what the hell's going on. And then there's the growing brutality from the remaining 33rd infantrymen that they are basically, they've gone rogue and are creating performing brutal acts on the civilians. And all of this has basically led to a lawless hellscape where pretty much anything goes in there in the city of Dubai. It is completely turned to shit, to put it nicely. All right, so Walker's job, again, is to enter the city, find Conrad, find the 33rd Battalion, and escort them out of the city. As he goes through and searches for Conrad in the city, Walker is forced to make many different choices that just slowly start to eat away at him and Delta Squad mentally. This includes killing American soldiers. He has a choice where he has to attempt to save a CIA agent, or CIA agent Gould, that is the name of the gentleman, or civilians that are being hauled away. There's a moment where one of the angry military factions that have split up during the Civil War go and capture a CIA agent, and Walker and his group overhear that during the interrogation of CIA agent Gould, there are other civilians being hauled away and they are likely to be executed. So Walker has to make the choice to either try and save the CIA agent or try and save the innocent civilians. There's another decision where Walker has to get through a choke point where there are just hundreds and hundreds of the 33rd Infantrymen Battalion that have rebelled, and there's no way to get through, and he is forced to use white phosphorus. And he has to use white phosphorus to kill these American soldiers who had defected. However, during the process of using the white phosphorus, he ends up accidentally setting off a chain reaction that kills dozens and dozens of innocent civilians who happen to be in the nearby area as well. There is another section where another decision where Walker has to choose between killing one of two captured individuals. One is someone who stole water because they needed the water to survive. The other is a soldier who was sent to arrest the civilian. However, in the process of trying to capture the civilian, ends up killing the civilian's entire family. Walker must choose between killing one of those two men as well. There is another segment where Walker must make a choice. A CIA agent has snuck into the city to steal the last supply of water, with the goal of wiping out every single last person in Dubai. And the reason why they want to do this is they basically want to cover up everything that happened in Dubai. Walker has to choose between either giving the man a quick, clean death or letting him burn alive. Another important thing to know is that originally, when collecting and stealing the water, the CIA agent lies to him and says the only reason why he is collecting the water is he will give it to the civilians. He just wants it to get away from the defected military groups so that they no longer have power. And in the process, completely destroys the tankers that have the water, basically sealing the fate of almost everyone in Dubai. So now Walker has a choice of, does he let the man burn alive because he's stuck underneath the truck that will kill him, or does he put a bullet in his head, giving him a quick and painless? There's another choice where Walker is after we talked before how Lugo was lynched by an angry mob. The angry mob then starts to turn on Walker and Adams, and Walker has to make a choice of how he wants to push through the situation, where he can open fire on unarmed civilians to guarantee that he can get through, or to try to find some other different means in which that he could get through the area without harming unarmed civilians. Then there is another choice where Walker finally comes face to face with Conrad at the end of the game, where he must make a choice: either accept everything that he did in Dubai was his own choosing, or he can deny it and still claim that everything was forced against him. He had no choice, that he was only doing what he had to because of the circumstances around him. There is also a post-game possible ending choice at the end, where Walker is being escorted away by soldiers. He is basically saved by the American army to take him out of the desert, and he has the choice to either hand over the weapon and then go back home, knowing he will be a shell of a former man, or understand that he has become a monster that cannot be saved, and open a fire on the soldiers that are trying to save him. All these different actions, all these different choices, regardless of the decision, in almost every single case, usually is some kind of awful decision as a whole that no one should really have to make or really want to make. And these choices affect Walker and Delta Squad horribly and manifest in a number of different ways. For first and foremost, their physical appearance. If you look at the image here on the left is how Walker looks at the beginning of the game. He looks much more composed, a typical soldier stance. He is in good shape for the most part. And then by the end of the game, he is completely beaten, battered, and bruised. His stance is not nearly as professional as it was before. And this is just an image render as opposed to how it looks in the final game, where he looks much more gruesome. And again, it is third person, so you can visibly see the wounds build on him as time goes on. Not only does he physically change, this is, again, not just the main character Walker, but also the other squad mates in the Delta Force group. They have call-outs that they make, where originally it would be requests to move forward or to help someone get up. They would be much more professional and tactical, whereas eventually as time goes on, they become much more aggressive and angry, where they say the others are just slowing them down and becoming problematic, as opposed to encouraging and trying to get them back on their feet. As well as in the combat, it's not just to one another, but also towards the opponents and their opposition, where before he would just give simple callouts of tango down. He would become much more angry and just vicious, where he would say, got another fucker, or that one's done, or that one's dead. There are executions in the game where when characters are on the ground and they're crawling away, and they're no longer a threat, you can simply knock them out. You can punch them in the head to make them unconscious, and then as time goes on, they become much more brutal, where they become, executions where he takes the gun, places on the forehead, and then pulls the trigger. There's one where there's like a magnum where he goes to put the gun up underneath someone's head, and the person tries to struggle to push it away, but he puts it back in place and puts a bullet through their skull. There's one, I believe, where he shoots them in the kneecap and then shoots them in the head to kill them. While it was before just a simple punch to the head, it then becomes one where he takes the butt of the gun and bashes them multiple times on top of the head. And this is, again, as the game goes on and they have to make these horrible choices that just mentally break them, it just becomes so much more aggressive, less professional, and more just letting the hatred and the anger in. Something that I saw this online, I could not see myself, but apparently Walker loses his trigger discipline. Trigger discipline is you never put your finger on the trigger unless you are ready to shoot. In this case, it would be if you're wandering around or walking, the soldiers are not supposed to have their fingers on the trigger. But as time goes on, Walker always has his finger on the trigger regardless. The way that the characters rationalize their decisions. As we talked before, there's a part where after Lugo is killed, the mob is then moving in on Walker and Adams. You have the choice of, do you open fire on the crowd or do you not? And if you do open fire on the crowd, Adams responds by saying that they deserved it because of what they did to Adams. So in the beginning of the game, and most other soldiers would never find a reason to really validate opening fire on unarmed civilians, they eventually do themselves. And probably the most notable change, the most obvious change, and most effective change that happens is the loading zone blurbs change. When you die, you reload a checkpoint. When you move on to the next level, there are loading screens, and at the bottom of the screen, there's text. Most games will take this as an opportunity to tutorialize the player, give them some understanding on settings and mechanics, build the lore, explain the story, and expand on it a lot more. And in the beginning of the game, they do this. They say there are certain blurbs that say Lugo's sniper training allows him to dispatch long-range targets, which is true. Logo is the marksman of the group, and this is meant to tutorialize players to go like, hey, if you find a target that's too far away, you can give the target to one of your squad mates, and Lugo will be able to take him out better. There's another one that says Dubai was once home to thousands of immigrant workers, most of whom were unable to escape. Again, building upon the story in Dubai and letting players know that there are so many innocent people who were just workers who could not escape everything. But as time goes on and more of these awful choices are forced to be made, the game just flat out starts breaking the fourth wall and addresses the player's actions directly. There are certain blurbs that are more difficult than others and much more impactful than others. One of them is, if Lugo, this was after Lugo has died, it says, if Lugo were still alive, he would likely suffer from PTSD. So really, he's the lucky one. There is another one that says, to kill for yourself is murder, to kill for your government is heroic, to kill for entertainment is harmless. Not only just addressing the game itself and players who play games who murder, shoot, gun down other people just for fun, but also showing the odd different categorization and circumstances that people who kill because they are in the army get a different type of appreciation than if someone who were to just kill for their own motivations back home. And then, of course, the very famous one, they have a loading zone blurb that says, do you feel like a hero yet? Again, directly addressing the player and questioning what it is that they have been doing up until that point. So there is just so much that builds upon all these different moral actions that happen in the game. Besides the player themselves, and moral actions in games are supposed to be how it reflects the player is supposed to feel. It's very difficult to make it reflect how it affects the in-game, and this game did a fantastic job by having it in so many different aspects, between just little details of how the players, how the characters respond to the world around them, how they physically looked in the world around them, but even doing a great job in actually using the breaking of the fourth wall as a way to address players, which is extremely difficult to do. It's so hard to break the fourth wall in a way that doesn't feel cheesy, doesn't feel cheap, and doesn't take the players out of the experience. That sounds really cool. Does that happen in other shooters as well? It does not. Spec Ops The Line was very, very unique in this attempt. I'm sure, when it comes to moral dilemmas in video games, it's always been a very difficult thing to do. We had BioShock 1, which had the Harvest versus the Rescue Little Sisters, and that in itself is a moral dilemma, but it really doesn't... It's basically like a sliding bar. This is evil, this is good. It's very obvious when you're doing the choice of harvest or rescue, which of those two is good and which of those two is bad. When it comes to moral choices in games, I believe that a moral choice is something that isn't as tangibly measured as good and bad, and isn't given to you in such clear defined roles. Whereas all these decisions where, do you kill the guy who is underneath the truck or not, they don't flat out tell you. They don't tell you. There's no blurb on screen that it says, Jeff asks you to put a bullet in his head. Do you give him a quick end or no? And then you choose yes or no. It's literally he speaks and says that the fire is coming. Please put a bullet in his head. Don't let him die like this. And it's up to the player to decide it. When they have the section where there's the two soldiers who are hanging from the ceiling, hanging from the ropes, the game tells you, through dialogue, you have to choose one of these two to kill. Do you kill the guy who stole the water? Or do you kill the soldier who was sent to apprehend the criminal and went overboard and killed a family? They go, you have to kill one of these. You have to shoot one of them. Which will you do? You could also choose to shoot the rope that the bodies are hanging from. You could choose to shoot the snipers that are looking at you. You could choose to not do anything and walk away. There are lots of different options. When it comes to the mob of civilians around, you see them closing in on you, you see them coming by you, and if you try to just walk away, you will start taking damage as they throw rocks at you, and Adams will say something about, we have to do something about this. So it's clearly all pointing you towards shooting the mob, but you can shoot up at the sky and it scares them away. It never directly tells you to do any of these things. So no, shooters don't really do this very often, and if shooters do have some kind of moral dilemma, in most cases from what I've seen, it's usually a binary choose option A or choose option B, as opposed to creating a world where you go in it, and based on the mechanics you have available to you. Alright. Hopefully we are back. My apologies. Really unfortunate that we didn't really have any issues with stream crashing the past week or so, but the second we decide to do a discussion stream, we have in the OBS seem to have stream crash. Unfortunate. Make sure before we continue. People saying that we're back. Hello, Skyhawk. Thank you for the support. How are you doing? All right. What was the last thing that you guys heard me say before stream crashed? Not quite sure where it broke down. Remember, I was answering Clag's question about asking about how other shooters and how other games do choices like that. I do hope more games do. I do hope that more games in the future will offer decisions and choices like that, where they're not as simple and binary as choose option A, B, or C by pressing A, B, or X. I hope that in the future, more games and more shooters will offer the opportunity to present a question and then allow the player to respond in a certain way. Granted, that is a lot harder to design in games for, because if you have 3 binary choices that you get by pressing 3 different buttons, it's a lot easier to, you know, progress the story and create content and have the actual results created in games so that they can go forward, as opposed to creating a space where the player can interact with it in different ways and based on those circumstances give different results. Like, it's definitely a lot harder, but it is one of the biggest things I think games can do to make the experience of gaming advanced so much better. So did you not hear any of my answer, Clag, at all? The discussion's been going good, Skyhawk. So much stuff to talk about with this game. Sorry. After the stream crash, I'm just trying to find my position. I was at again. You didn't hear any of the answer? It was quite a long response. I don't want to go through the entire thing again, to be completely honest. When I upload the video, I'll remember to look for this timestamp and I'll send you a response, because it is locally recording on my end, so I definitely have the answer. And I will upload on YouTube and I'll be sure to let you know. Basically, the answer is no. Other shooters have not done this to the extent. When it comes to moral choices, they are much more binary. It's much more simple. And usually moral choices aren't as common in shooters. And if they are, they definitely are not manifested and the results are not shown through the personalities of the players, of the characters, especially to the degree that they do in Spec Ops 1. I'm sure there are examples out there. I'm sure there are other games that have attempted it. I don't know of any. And this was also back in 2012. I imagine this was also much less common back then, for shooters especially. So, Dishonored had attempted it. Dishonored came out afterwards, correct? And there was, again, a moral choice system in Dishonored. However, those were mostly the results of other people around you and the world around you. And mostly, I want to say it was summed up at the end by one guy. The guy who's in the boat. I don't think it was a massive... I think it was just a simple good ending versus bad ending. It was not something that really changed your experience throughout the game or was reflected in your experience throughout the game. So those are... I mean, we're still talking about the story. Those are the different... how the choices reflect in the characters. But we also have... It was basically how many people that you killed, as opposed to doing non-lethal means. You have the environment itself was very important for the story and the setting. The idea of a chaotic and transformational forces would become one of the centerpieces of Spec Ops: The Line, where one moment you would be somewhere fighting another faction, gunning it out, and then the next moment, all of a sudden, there's a massive sandstorm that rolls in. Everyone breaks away and has to go for cover somewhere else. To make it feel like no matter where you were, you feel like you know what the opposition, you know what the problem is and what you need to deal with, but you wouldn't actually see. You wouldn't actually know. You would commonly forget that there are other forces to worry about. In this case, that would be the sandstorm. They wanted the players to feel this constant pressure looming from the environment around them. As you have, you're reminded of just how high the sand has come up against the buildings around the skyscrapers in the town. When you go into buildings and you see the windows are completely blocked out by the sand. And then, of course, when the massive sandstorms roll on, the environment was a major factor when creating the setting in the environment and how the players were to feel moving from place to place. Oftentimes, and then I'll always take down your target, which is even worse. Oh, absolutely. In Dishonored, there's the one character who you can either assassinate her or you can drug her so she passes out, and then you take her unconscious body to a boat below a castle where an obsessive stalker takes her. And that's how she's disposed of. She's not murdered. She's no longer in her position of power. She no longer has influence on what's going around because she's essentially been kidnapped. But a lot of people would argue with this man who's an obsessed stalker, maybe it might have been just better to kill her. So yeah, Dishonored itself is a very, very interesting game with how both gameplay wise, but also how they chose to make the non-lethal choices. But yeah, some of them can be argued that the non-lethal way to dispose of someone is worse than if you were to actually kill them. The fate is that the life is worse than death. No, I did not play Dishonored 2. I really wanted to, because I love Dishonored 1. So going back to the choices, I want to talk more about the decisions behind the choices and how they kind of came to the decisions and the development process of the choices as opposed to how it manifests in the game. So some of the non-lethal takedowns are even worse. Which ones would be worse than... I mean, that's the one that stands out in my head. Oh, you're talking about Dishonored 2. Ooh, cool. That's good to know. I'm excited. So for the choices, Williams, this was one of the writers. Excuse me. Knew early on that moral choices were going to be a key aspect with the game, because that is it's something that always happens whenever there is conflict. And the choices that you make in war differ greatly from the choices that you make in video games. As I just discussed before, they aren't binary choices of good or bad. That's why choices are presented in the game the way that they are. Choices don't often look like choices, but they are just moments that occur in the game as you continue. Because of this, a lot of players don't even realize that they had made a choice until following subsequent playthroughs. So for example, you have the part where the two men are hanging from the ropes, and you have to choose either to kill the civilian who stole the water or the soldier who killed the civilian's family. You can choose to kill the soldiers. You can choose to kill one of the soldiers, or you can choose to shoot the ropes that they're hanging from and the bodies drop. You could also choose to shoot the snipers who are aiming at you from over the sand dunes. But a lot of people don't know that these are other options or choices until subsequent playthroughs. How's the reception to the aspect of this game, since it seems more critical of Army than other shooters? We will absolutely get to that, Clyde. Don't you worry. That is a very good question, and something that I will be addressing later. But yeah, a lot of players had no idea. Sometimes they would go to a section and that they had made a choice. Again, one of the more famous options is the one with the angry mob. You know, you have the angry mob is slowly moving in on the player character, and you know, your character Adams is saying, we have to do something. If you try to just walk away, you get bombarded with rocks and then you eventually die. A lot of players don't know there is a choice here. You can either shoot the civilians or shoot up in the air to scare them away. They don't think it's a choice because the game doesn't binarily just say shoot at the civilians or shoot at the sky. 99% of people are going to shoot at the sky because they're going to know they're unarmed civilians and don't want to do anything about it. But because the game is a shooter, they assumed because of what's presented to them, they have to gun down the civilian. They don't know it's a choice. They are just acting based on what they know, which reveals a lot about the people who play the game. With the choices, one of the major inspirations about how choices would present to themselves in the game was actually in Fallout 3. Early in the game, there is a father and daughter talking. The father is the overseer of the vault they're stationed in. Basically, that means he's the one in charge of the vault that they're stationed in. During the conversation between the father and daughter, William said that he was playing and he had the crosshairs over the overseer's head. And he thought to himself, there's no way they're going to let me kill a major character like this. This was the last thought he had before the overseer's head exploded all over his daughter's face. This inevitably led to a rippling effect to the story going down the line. Williams wanted to build on this feeling of choices and consequences with Spec Ops, where at any point you'd think, there's no way I can do this, they wouldn't let me do this. Not only can you actually do that, but it has a rippling effect that goes further down the line based on your choices and consequences. How the choices themselves are presented, varies throughout the game. Sometimes the player will find themselves in situations where they can stop, take everything in, and think about what's happening before making a choice. That would be the choices like, for example, the two men hanging from the ropes, where you can look at everything, think for a second, and make your decision. Sometimes the choice is presented more dramatically and ominously with very little time to decide. And choices like this would be the mob trying to move in, or the man, Jeff, who is stuck underneath the truck, and you have the choice of either letting him burn alive or put a bullet in his head, which you have very little time to make that decision because the fire is creeping towards him. When it came to making these difficult decisions, angering people was an active goal by the devs when making the game, especially with the white phosphorus scene. The team didn't care about crossing a line. They wanted people to be angry because that's what they felt would be a normal human reaction to those scenes when it comes to these decisions. Williams said that, quote, "That's a moment where a human being, if you were actually a soldier in that situation, you would have to make that very conscious choice of trying to move on and accept what you had done." So he's basically trying to put the players in the same position as the soldier, where when you would make these decisions, you would have to live with it. They wanted the player to feel awful because if you were a soldier in that position, you would have to continue with the knowledge that you had done that and try to actively move forward. Is the line. Yep, exactly, my bad. He continues on with, quote, "We were hoping that choice would be mirrored in the players. They would look at this game and go, wow, is this a game that I want to finish playing? And if I do, I have to accept what just happened and choose to keep playing this game." This would itself mirror Walker continuing to push forward with his mission despite all the awful things that he had done instead of just walking away. So the players, you know, they wanted the players to think, do I really want to continue playing this after everything that I've done? Is this something I still want to continue taking part in? Just like Walker himself has to make the decision of, do I want to continue on this mission despite everything I've had to do up until this point? During playtesting, when players would get to the white phosphorus scene, people were pausing the game and actually leaving the room. This was a scene where, again, as we talked before, Walker and his group would have to move through an area, but they could not get through it because the area was just swarmed with defected soldiers. So there was just too many of them to get through. There's no way to outgun them and take them down. And so you're forced, in order to if you want to progress through, you have to use white phosphorus, which in itself is very questionable a means of warfare. But when you do use it, you afterwards have to look at everything you had done. It's so beautifully done because the way it's done is you take a mortar and you shoot up a small a camera that has a parachute. So as it falls down, the camera itself is just simply recon and information, and that information is then relayed to the other player, who then shoots the white phosphorus. So while you're playing the game, the camera shows everything in a like a what's it called, a night vision view, where everything that just, or sorry, not a night vision, I think it's like a heat-seeking vision, a heat vision, where it just shows these white blob outlines where the people are, and that's information for the player to shoot the white phosphorus. So you just continue killing all the soldiers, and then when it's all said and done, you look away from the screen and you see this absolute hellscape as everything is just set on fire and soldiers are just charred and burned. And then after you walk through the scene with all the charred soldiers that are dead all over your feet, you walk and then you realize that during this time you accidentally set off a chain reaction that caused a little encampment that had civilians that were trying to be ushered out of the city, that were going to be escorted and evacuated. They were huddled in an area and they also got caught in it. And so you have this scene where you walk up and you see a bunch of charred dead bodies, as well as a mother holding her daughter as they are burned as well. During this playtesting scene, many players were pausing the game and leaving the room. Others that did play through the part to the end were often upset that it had happened and that the devs had put them in that particular moment and forced them to do it. And this is pretty much exactly where the devs wanted the players to be emotionally. That was the response that they were looking for when they played that scene. Overall, during the testing phase, they were getting a lot of different reactions based on the personal morales of the players and the decisions that they made. And this actually made the devs extremely happy. And this was one of my biggest takeaways from this, and I thought this was great. They thought The devs thought that if they got consistent reactions, that would mean they created a story that guides everyone down a linear emotional path. Instead, they created a game where people can examine their feelings based on what's presented to them and the results of their actions. I feel like when people debate and talk about games or movies or books or other entertainment medium, there seems to be this idea that things need to always get a certain type of response. And while I think the writers and the creators of these different forms of media definitely are trying to get a certain response, I think the most important for them is that they get some type of response. If everything were to always net the exact same result every single time, it wouldn't be natural or organic. It wouldn't be something that's really felt that way. You're being guided down a certain path to feel a specific way. And so with Spec Ops The Line, because they had all these very different results, it really was organic emotion that was coming out of the players and how they felt when put in these moments. And I absolutely love that. I really hope more creators and more writers have this type of mentality, that it's not about getting people to feel a certain way. It's about getting people to feel at all, to feel something. That, and if it has varying results, then you know that you've done something that is it brings out true actual emotions, as opposed to kind of tricking someone or guiding someone to feel a certain way, which is a lot easier to do. The goal end result with all of these moral choices was to make the consequences of these choices exist more within the player emotionally, rather than tied to gameplay mechanics that would feed back into the choice. So the devs didn't want players to get a gun of lesser or better quality because of a moral choice, or, say like a faction liking you more or less. This would basically be mechanics that would lead to choices. For example, factions giving you an option instead of mechanics that lead to lasting feelings associated with the choice. So I think another way to describe this is that they basically wanted to make it so that all these moral choices wouldn't tie back into other mechanics. It was entirely tied to the player and their experience themselves. Whereas in the, with BioShock is another good example. You could maybe want to harvest the little sister because you think there are monstrosities and you think that they need to go. But at the same time, maybe you heard from someone that if you save them, if you rescue them, you actually get more Adam in the end. And that would be something that could possibly motivate them to make a different decision. And that's not what the devs were trying to go for. They were trying to make it so that everyone would make a decision based on how they actually personally felt, not because of the rewards that would be associated with it. And examples of that would be giving a better gun, giving a lesser quality gun. Maybe there was at some point factions in the game where a certain faction would support you, one of the two sides that eventually led to the Civil War, making one side like you more or one side like you less, based on the choices that you made. They didn't want any of the choices to reflect gameplay mechanics. They wanted specifically everything that was a result of those choices to be manifested in your emotional state and your opinions and your views of everything going on. Which, again, I think is fantastic. I think that is a much better decision. While it can be more content, where, you can play through the game again and you play it again because this time you got a different gun to play through, I think it is much more impactful and lasting if something gives you a completely unique feeling, an organic feeling, an emotional state when playing the game, than giving you some other different toys to use. But this is also very interesting to think about. At the end of everything, the entire story is linear and has the same end result. There's no branching narratives in this game. You have all these different choices, and they all have these very different effects and feelings in people, but no matter what choices you make, you will still go through the same story beats. You will still go through the same areas. You will still have the same characters. People will die earlier or later based on your choices. Things won't be easier or harder based on your choices. All of these moral decisions are strictly something that affects the player. But again, they still have all these branching different feelings and different experiences, which is so incredibly impressive to me. I feel like when it comes to these decisions, they tend to have these branching narratives that either are very superficial or very expansive and almost crazy different. but they managed to do it in a way that is still the exact same experience. It's the same story, linear plot-wise, but it's completely different experiences to you overall. It's so damn impressive. And the really crazy thing about this too is everything that progressed in the game, everything that continues in this game, was all because it was all in the means of trying to answer the question of what happened to John Conrad. They were able to create the story, all these different feelings, and keep pushing forward, all because of one question, and that was what happened to John Conrad. So much of this game is very, very simple and broken down, but so damn impressive. So, the game itself was basically built around a bait and switch type of model. The devs' goal was to get people to boot up the game, expecting just any other typical basic COD clone. Wow, we have the image that just happens to be the same one as the box cover. But I mean, you look at that box cover, it is extremely generic, very typical first-person shooter, military shooters. I mean, isn't that the thing for a time? Is that it was always the character who had the gun up, walking towards the camera, walking towards the front of the box, partially covered, scowled face, in some kind of uniform. This game was absolutely created and designed and marketed to try to get people to buy the game expecting it to be just another type of COD clone. Another game that was very similar and comparable to Call of Duty. All the advertising, the trailers just showed only the run and gun gameplay. They do not at all emphasize or even really talk about the moral choices that happen in the game. It's, there's the droves of enemies, the faceless enemies that just seem to come around the corner, that die in 1 or 2 shots. They wanted people to expect another Call of Duty clone so that they could completely pull the rug out from under you, because, again, the whole idea of the game is to make people second guess their ideas about war games, and the fact that when you do this stuff, you're not a hero. So that is the group specifically that they wanted to pull in. So now we've talked about the game and all the decisions that went into it, the moral choices, and I want to take a second to talk about the publisher. Like with a lot of these decision games, it feels like it comes down to one of 2 final choices that determines your final ending, and so much of the previous choices have no impact. The events that happen may be the same, but do people's reactions to situations change when it comes to that decision? Very true. And the funny thing is, this game does do that. The game has multiple choices, and it all does come to a culmination at the end, but I definitely feel like the choices that you make do have some kind of significant impact on the player's mental state and decision-making when it comes to making the final choice at the end of the game. And it's also really great because it's one of those things where when you want to see the other endings, you don't have to play through an entire game. We have all these different branching choices that come all the way to the end. Because it's a single, linear, straightforward story, you can still play through the game and have your choices at the end all make sense. But if you want to see what the alternative endings could be at the end, you could just load up the last chapter that the game has and make the choices at the end there. But it's true. Most of these games that have choices and branching narratives and all these paths, it doesn't matter. It all comes down to, in the end, usually an ending that has like 1 of 2 or 3 choices. It's totally true. I agree. So, again, I want to take a second to talk about the publishers. And that would be 2K in this case. So publishers, for those who are uninformed, for those who don't know, when was this game released? It was June 26th, 2012. This was 8 years ago. For those who are uninformed, for those who don't know, developers are the people who make the game. Publishers are the ones who supply the money. In most cases, publishers are the people who supply the money to pay the developers. They're the ones who pay for the manufacturing costs to get the games printed on discs and shipped out. They're the ones who pay for the advertising. They're the ones who basically front the money, and they take out a big chunk. Because of this, the publishers are usually the ones who are in the position of power, and they can, in most cases, tell developers what to do. And a lot of times, because the publishers are the ones that are funding the money, and they are doing these things, again, in most cases, for profit, because they are a business, a lot of them tend to follow an Excel spreadsheet. They follow data and statistics and research to the decimal when making most decisions. And when they make decisions, it's usually based on this research on, you know, money in versus money out, certain decisions and changes, whether it's going to net them more profit or not. And like, this isn't inherently a bad thing. It sounds awful, and it can, and in a lot of cases is not good, but it's not inherently always bad. For developers, having someone to balance out the passion and the emotion that the developers have behind the product with someone who is much more cold and direct can be a great balance if it's struck nicely. Publishers are the ones who will give a deadline and push developers to actually make progress. Developers, in a lot of cases, I mean, that's why development hell happens in some games, where they have this idea and they really want to make it work, and they're trying and they're refining and they're tweaking and they're changing and they're updating, and they never move forward because they're stuck on this one thing. Publishers, because they are the boss, they have a deadline that they can give. It forces games to constantly be moving forward into the next step. The problem is, though, they themselves are not developers. So sometimes they will make demands and requests that don't really make any sense. That doesn't make sense to the developers or to the players and gamers themselves. For example, the publishers for this game, they demanded that this game have a multiplayer mode, which goes against the entire philosophy of the game. The idea about this game is to emphasize and prove the point that you're not a hero. When you play these games, you're trying to have a hero complex where you are going in, you are this one man takes on an army, this one man takes on a country, kills everyone, and comes out, and you're hailed as a hero for saving your country, for saving the world. This whole game is supposed to be showing what actually happens when people go into war and they're forced to make these difficult decisions, and how it just breaks them down into shells of who they are before. To take the game and make a multiplayer mode, that's essentially making a fun mode out of killing other people, definitely is directly contradictory to the idea with the game. So there are times where the publishers make decisions that absolutely are completely contradictory and make no sense. So it's not always good, but it's not always bad that publishers have this position of power. But because of the position that publishers have, they are more often than not, in the position of a thankless job. A thankless job being a job that when it's done well, no one notices that they're doing it in the first place, so no one thinks of them. When a game does come out and it's well made, it's well received, people love it, everyone always goes, that developer's fantastic. They made this fantastic fucking game. It's wonderful. Developer, they're so good. But when something goes wrong, everyone really knows about it, and they're tended to be given shit for it. So when a game does awful, it's not uncommon for the players to sometimes blame the publishers for, you know, getting too much involved or meddling too much of the development process. Obviously, developers will get shit, but a lot of times it's usually no one thanks the publishers. But if the publisher is brought to the conversation, it's usually like, oh, well, they probably fucked this up so bad. The best comparison is that quote from Futurama: if you've done nothing right, then no one will know you've done anything at all. That's basically the job of the publisher. They fund the games. If the game does great and people love it, people give big old thumbs up to the developer. If the game does poorly, usually if the publisher is brought up, it's because they're getting shit and blamed for saying that they meddle too much. Now, let me just be clear here. I am not defending big money and big corporations here. Well, I mean, they are the ones who, publishers are the ones who lay down the money. And they're usually the ones laying down the money because they're in the position to spend money and risk that money. I'm not exactly punching down by like shitting on the publishers here, but basically publishers should be, if they are hiring people, if they are pulling on a team to make their game, they should be one that trusts the team. Like if you're hiring someone to make a game, you should absolutely trust them to know what they're doing to make their games. But it's also important to really acknowledge, and that's why I think it's very important to acknowledge, sorry, I did not rehearse this part of the script as much. It is very important to acknowledge when a publisher does something admirable like this, and that is absolutely the case when it comes to Spec Ops: The Line, where the publisher did a great job. I'm going to be completely upfront with this. It took fucking balls for for 2K to publish this game. This was a game that was going to tackle some very difficult subjects in a very difficult way. They were going to have a game where your mission is to gun down American military soldiers who defected. The game was going to present this player with scenarios that were awful, where you could fire on unarmed civilians, you could set them on fire, you can essentially commit war crimes all over the place. They were going to make a game where the main character is essentially the bad guy. A game, again, the main character being a bad guy who is an American soldier. And it was a game where, for all intents and purposes, they were making a game that wasn't meant to be fun. All of this is extremely risky to greenlight. It is not easy to pitch a game and sell a game like this. It has all of these different criteria in it. Better to listen to. There we go. And it takes absolute balls to just do something that's new and unique in its own right is difficult and risky to do, and a lot of publishers won't do it. You have all of these factors in it is insane and just absolutely wild that a publisher was okay to do this. During the development process of Spec Ops, the devs understandably thought that they had overstepped the line quite a few times during development, but despite this, 2K kept giving them green lights over and over to continue producing the game. There was one time in particular that really caused some alarm bells to go off for some of the higher ups at 2K. That was during the playtesting scene we talked about before, where the white phosphorus scene playtesters were playing, and then they were walking out when they got to that scene. The higher ups knew that they wanted to make a game that really created a powerful experience for players, but they started to think about the fact that, like, what if at what point is powerful too powerful? At what point is creating a really strong experience just too much for players? And the risk is, if they create a game that is too powerful, that has too strong of an experience like this, no one might buy it. And the lead producer on Spec Ops spoke to the higher ups, and I don't know how he did it, but basically, apparently in an interview he said it was summed up with this, where when he spoke to them, he said, when talking about the players who walked out, the playtesters who walked out during the white phosphorus scene, he said that right there is the result of good art. The question is, do you want to make art in that way? And the higher ups thought about it, and they said, you know what? Yep, fuck it, we'll do it. So not only was the subject matter ripe for the picking for scrutiny and attack, but playtesting showed alarming results that would have sent most other publishers running for the hills, not wanting to be a part of any of this. In a position that 2K had every right in the world to tell developers to scale it back, with subject matter that any other publishers would have told the developers to scale it back. A decision that most players probably would have completely understood. Despite all of that, 2K still kept giving them the green light. Because at the end of the day, 2K wanted to make art with this. They wanted to make a unique experience in gaming that no one had ever done before up until that point. They were willing to put their money behind a new idea, a really risky and scary idea. They hired a team to make that game, and they trusted that team to make it. Every step of the way in this game's development, 2K was a publisher that put art and vision above everything else, and that damn deserves recognition. So there are tons of publishers that do a really shitty job, that really like to meddle in a lot of stuff, but when it came to this game specifically, 2K abso-fucking-lutely deserves recognition and praise for being really fucking ballsy when it came to this. So kudos to them. Who pitched this game? So we talked about this earlier in the discussion, but so the Spec Ops IP had existed in the late 90s, early 2000s, and it didn't sell that well. So they decided to take a step back and let the IP sit for a while. And then 2K, who owned the IP, started shopping around to different developers, asking them to think of pitch ideas that they can do with the IP. Because 2K wanted to do something with the IP. They thought enough time had passed, and they wanted to try to do something different to separate themselves from the negative association that the IP had in the past. So 2K took the IP and went to different developers and asked them to pitch an idea. One of the lead writers for the game suggested an idea that takes place in Dubai with futuristic soldiers, And 2K decided to decline and said, no, thank you. We're going to look elsewhere. So they went to different publishers for about 2 more years and then came back to that same writer and said, you know what? We thought about it. We like this idea, but we want to make some changes. We want to make it a little bit more dark. We want to make it more mature. We want it to, you know, something along those lines. Can you work with us to try to think of something? And they collaborated, and then that eventually manifested and turned into what would become Spec Ops: The Line. I'm so fucking jealous, Goof. I'm so jealous because I went into this game knowing quite a bit about it. I knew what the twist was and what they were going for at the end. I didn't know exactly how it progressed. But, God, I really wish I could have fucking played this game blind. Not that I'm aware of. I don't know of any games that completely pulls this off, at least not off the top of my head. I hope there is more games like this. There's also the fact that they kind of antagonizes the people. Exactly. It absolutely does. Yeah. It basically is, if people who do enjoy this type of game, that's another good point, Lumpy. The people who purchased the game unknowingly what was about to happen were the types of people who enjoyed the type of games that this game makes fun of. The type of people who play these games are people who, in most cases, usually do it for some kind of hero fantasy. Or, God, I can't think of the word. Hero complex, that's it. They have some kind of hero complex where they want to be someone who goes in as one soldier, takes out an entire country, and comes back hailed as the person who saved democracy and saved the world. And this whole game is basically shitting on people, saying directly to them, you are not a hero. What you do for this does not make you a hero. Like, it directly approaches the player. So fucking risky, so fucking ballsy to do. Yep, they are German. Yep, no, it is German. But so the studio itself is German, but I believe 2 of the 3 writers were from America. They both lived in Texas. So it is a studio that takes place in Germany, but a lot of the people working on this were American. Wow, that's hilarious, Goof. Wow, God, I wish I could have done that. So, we've talked about most of the major things about this game. Now we're going to talk about what about the game itself was groundbreaking and or influential. And definitely the big thing that was groundbreaking about this game was its approach to storytelling in the military shooter genre, as well as it categorized the American military to make the it's always seen as. I mean, the American military is seen as a beacon of patriotism, the good thing in the world. You can attack countries, criticize them for tons of different things, but the people who are in the military, people who put their lives on the line to save other people, it's basically like the one subject you cannot criticize, you cannot put down, because they are putting their lives on the line to save yours. So to put a game where the entire thing is about American soldiers killing American soldiers, all of them committing war crimes, defecting, killing innocent civilians, is so fucking risky to do, and no one had really done that, especially to the scale that a major AAA game had done. So that itself was fucking... that was new. That was definitely groundbreaking and new. The other thing was using sand as a tool for its isolation. Like we said, we did have BioShock, which had... it used water as its form of isolation for its setting. And Dubai used sand in a similar way, but not completely directly the same way. I'm not sure of many other games that use sand at all to the same extent that they did for this game. For what it is, for how this game itself was influential, what it made people realize that video games as a medium are more than capable of mature storytelling and subject matter. That video games are not just for children, and our abilities to tell stories through video games have really barely scratched the surface. And I feel as time has gone on, we've definitely had more games that have approached more serious and difficult subject matter in its compared to how it was in the past, because people have realized just how significant choices can be and how strong of an emotion that video games can get from people, and approach these different difficult topics that no one really wants to talk about. All right, so we're not done with the discussion. I'm going to take a short break. I've been talking for about 2 hours right now, so I'm going to go to the bathroom. I'm going to get a drink. I'm going to grab a quick snack. If you need to go to the bathroom, if you need to get a drink, go to the bathroom. You go to the bathroom, get a drink, stretch your legs, now look at a monitor, walk around, whatever. Now would be the time to do it. We'll be back in like 5, maybe 10 minutes, so we shall return. Doesn't. Look at that. All right, here we go. All right. I have good news, everyone. I'm gonna get food poisoning. Hooray! Hooray, I'm getting food poisoning because I forgot to put my poke bowl in the fridge. So, and unfortunately, obviously, I said that. That'll be fun. When that eventually comes back to bite me in the ass. But I was really hungry. That's what I had prepared, Phil. I was not about to waste that food. So. Hello, puppy. Like some pets before I go back to the... Woke up from her nap because she heard me walking around out there. You know what? I've showed stream multiple times. I don't think I've showed YouTube my puppy yet. This is my puppy. All right. Forgot I'm wearing a black shirt, so she's gonna all over me now. All right, back to the topic at hand. We have just finished talking about Spec Ops, the final product. So much to break down about the story, how they came to the decisions of making their moral choice system, the balls that it took for 2K to publish this game, and so much more. So now we're gonna go on to the actual reception. Review scores. When it comes to games, obviously, review scores aren't a fantastic system. They are a very generic binary number system. They don't at all reflect the quality of the game. I know a lot of people don't like them. However, when it comes to getting a reception view, a point from the players as well as the industry, it is definitely the best average system to go by. So for this section, when we talk about reception, I just pulled the numbers off of Metacritic, a site that takes all of these scores and just averages out into one final score. And then I present those to you. An important thing to know, though, is with Metacritic, if a review from a credible professional source does not give a number score, if they give a letter score, or if they don't give a score at all at the end, what they will do is they will go over that review and try to assign it a number as close as accurate as possible as they seem to interpret, and then that is put into the aggregate and averaged out. This is for older games not so much an issue because the trend of not actually giving a score at the end of reviews is something that is much more modern. This game, having come out in 2012, was still very common for people to give number scores, so I don't think that'll affect it too drastically, but it is something to know. Hi, Booper. So going on to the review scores of the game, the reviews for this game were pretty mixed, with the average Metacritic professional critic score being a 76, as well as the average player score being an 8.2. It was, again, pretty middling down the line. I'm sure there's lots of reasons people can think of, but the public reception was at first it was very, very mixed. As time has gone on, it's garnered more of a cult following and more of a widespread appreciation as people actually understand and been able to analyze and truly know what the point of this game was and what it was trying to say and what it was trying to do. But in terms of actual reviews, it was very polarizing, but for different reasons. So in most reviews, the positive side of the review was almost unanimously the story. People loved it for its risky approach on a serious topic, and for it tackling it from a very controversial standpoint, making, again, Americans the bad guys. Yo, what's Grimmy? Thank you for the host. We're doing a discussion for Spec Ops The Line right now. If anyone has not played this game, it's a fantastic game. I think everyone should take a look at. Only takes about 6 or 7 hours to beat. And I can't really say specifically why, because it kind of ruins the big twist ending. Not even twist ending. What it's trying to say with the game. It basically, I think the best way to sum it up without really spoiling it is it's a game that approaches the military shooter genre and tries to draw in people who expect it to be a very basic, generic military shooter. So that it can completely turn left and go somewhere completely different with what it's trying to say. Not into a completely different genre, but in a way that approaches a topic that can absolutely be told through military shooters, but has not in the past. So we've gone through the bulk of the discussion. We've been going for 2 hours at this point, and we're just getting to the public reception of the game right now. I hope your stream was good, Grimmy. And I hope you like the new killer. I'm actually going to be playing afterwards. So the positive reception for the game was mostly for the story was the big part, because it approaches such a very risky topic and a very serious topic, but also the way that it does approach this serious topic. Again, as we said before, it is, the American military is the bad guy in this case, but also you are the protagonist who is also American military, and he defects. Well, I shouldn't say defects, but he also progresses into what most people would consider a bad guy. And it's just Americans everywhere, American military killing each other, killing innocent civilians, and committing war crimes in the process. So the appreciation for tackling such a risky topic was very well and positively received. The location, the setting, many games, especially military shooters, tend to take place in the Middle East, but not Dubai is a much more unique area. The actual setting was a nice fresh tweak compared to what other military shooters were doing, and people also seem to have a great fondness and appreciation for the aesthetic and focus on sand being a huge factor. There was a very positive reception to the characters. Going back to the story being so lauded, part of it was the characters also being so highly received for having arcs that didn't pull any punches, with how they change over time when going through these atrocities and these horribly stressful situations. Now, for the negatives, again, the story also drew quite a bit of negative reception. But while most people loved the story, there were people who were disgusted that they were forced to commit these atrocities, when the funny thing is the goal of the game is to make you realize that the only way to win is to put the game down and to walk away, to not play. That is the feeling that they're going for. They want you to feel disgust, and they want you to feel angry and upset when you are forced to do all these types of things, because you are the person who's actually playing and actually going through with these actions, that you could put the game down at any time, but because you force yourself, forced to go through, you feel angry when it's really all your choice in the end. It was not the developer's decision. So I find it kind of funny that the negative association with the story, it's kind of funny the negative association with the story is kind of the part that they were poking at to try to make people think what they were doing. Another negative review point that the game commonly got was its very basic shooting mechanics. While the story is praised, it was also criticized for the actual combat being extremely basic and simple. There's nothing really new or unique that grabbed players a lot. They had the sand mechanics, but it really was not a whole lot in terms of offering some kind of new play style to get people into the game. And they did have the squad targeting mechanic, but again, because there was such simplistic basic mechanics, the fact that the targeting system was inconsistent or buggy was just highlighted even more, because you think with less features or less options to approach these scenarios that it would make sure everything works flawlessly and cleanly, but that was not the case. So the actual gunplay was criticized quite a bit. And lastly, the other very common thing that the game was criticized for was for the length. The game takes on average about 6 or 7 hours to beat. And it's kind of funny. We had the whole discussion with Portal about, a shorter game being an absolutely perfect. It was a shorter game, but it was just the perfect length to, cut out all the fat and trim it down to be just a perfect experience. And that is clearly what they did in this game. They had a very specific story they wanted to tell. They had a very specific experience that they wanted the players to have. So they didn't add anything, any kind of fluff or any kind of extra filler space. And I think the reason why it worked so well for Portal and didn't get as much backlash is because it was either packaged into a big deal, a big package that came with other games, or when it was sold as its own separate thing, it was only $20, whereas when this game came out, it was $60. And the other thing is, while it is a shorter game, there is the possibility of repeat playthroughs. The short playtime, as we said, the very basic, simplistic combat mechanics, makes it so repeat playthroughs are, there's not much incentive to get it done. So it was mostly positively received when it came to the story. However, it seems that the more basic gameplay aspects seem to hold the score back, which I find kind of interesting. And I feel like if a game like this came out today, it would be much more positively received, because while the story was so huge, it was so risky, it was so groundbreaking, and it was done so well and executed so fantastically. And that was clearly what they were mainly going for with this experience of the game. The fact that the combat was much more simplistic in what the player could have to do really pulled back on the scores a whole lot. And I think in more modern day times, if this game was released today, it would have better, higher critic scores. Something I found interesting. Yeah, it's about 6 to 7 hours to beat. You've never played, so you want... Wait, did you try to play DVD but you couldn't find a match or something? So that was the critical reception. Talking about the sales, the game unfortunately did not sell very well. At this point, according to VG Game Charts, the game has sold just 1.2 million copies. It sold 230,000 copies on PC, 420,000 blaze it on the Xbox 360, and 550,000 copies on the PlayStation 3, which I found very surprising, because Xbox tends to have more dude bro type of gamers on there who like military shooters. I would have for sure thought this game would sell a lot better on the Xbox, especially since the Xbox 360, at least earlier in the generation, had more sales, more consoles out than the PlayStation. Very, very surprised this game sold more on the Xbox than the PlayStation. Not only and this was also according I looked on VG charts. Usually they source where they get their numbers from. They didn't this time, so take these numbers with a grain of salt. But also if I had to guess, this would probably be a couple years after release. This is grand total. This is not 1.2 million copies in the first week or the first month of the first year. This is some point afterwards. So it definitely did not do good in its first couple weeks, considering in its first week of sales in the UK, it was beat out by Lego Batman and a knockoff generic Spider-Man game. So the fact that in its first week, it was outsold by two other... Lego games sell pretty well, but the other one's kind of a generic game. Not really a great sign for it. According to Take-Two, during a financial report, they partially blamed their poor quarter sales on Spec Ops Online. They had projected to sell more copies, and it actually undersold so much that they didn't reach numbers that they were expecting to. So the game did not sell very well. In terms of sequels, the game was received very well, but sold poorly and was a commercial failure. And the other thing that's interesting is all through development, there was no plans to make a sequel for the next game. So that kind of worked out to developers, but because of the commercial failure and the sales, there really was no plan to create a second game. But I do want to talk for a second real quick to talk about the fact that there was no plans for a sequel. Spider-Man game? No, it was not Time Spider-Man game. I think it was like the Marvelous Spider-Man or Wonderful Spider-Man, something like that. Oh, he never played Spec Ops Online. I was asking if he enjoyed the new Killer Ant DVD. Oh, I'm an idiot. Sorry, I'm like trying to keep the discussion going, and now I realize what he's saying. Anyway, So when it came to this game, they didn't leave it on any type of cliffhanger. And early on in development, it was agreed that they were actually going to kill the main character. And this in itself is very shocking, not only that they were going to do this, but that 2K was okay with this. As we talked before, the devs spent a lot of time on creating the character of Walker. They spent a lot of time making him believable. They spent a ton of time into building the mental deterioration of him that progresses through the game. They spent a lot of time trying to make a game that was enough of a blank slate that people could put themselves into and experience as well. They had a character that they spent a lot of time giving these awful experiences to, and it gave them, in the end, more of a very disappointing ending. And this was very a stark contrast to what happens in most games, where they tend to have more of a fairy tale happy type of ending. And this was one of the endings he had if he doesn't kill himself, which I believe is the true ending. There's another ending where he gets out of the desert, but he's a complete broken shell of a man who doesn't believe he's ever going to be able to go back to society and fully become a part of it. And this is basically a perfect setup for a sequel. This is like a dream setup for a sequel where the character has this redemption arc that leads to a happy ending for the protagonist to eventually, go from this cliffhanger ending where it seems so terrible and awful, and then he becomes this happy person by the end of it. The fact that all this time and money was put into a character just to have a bullet put in his head by the end of the game, entirely shutting the idea of a sequel down, is not an easy sell to do in AAA gaming. So it's really remarkable that not only that they thought about doing this and decided doing this on early on, and again, like I said before, I wanted to bring attention and really acknowledge and praise the publisher for focusing more on the art with this game more than anything else, as opposed to making a bunch of decisions to try and sell to a wider audience. Again, they were okay with this. They were fine with the idea of, if this is going to make a more impactful ending and story, then they were okay with killing off the main character, which again, I think deserves attention and praise. So even if the game did do well and did sell well, there was no plans for a sequel to be made from the game at all. The killer's weird. Yeah, they are really weird. I'm excited. I'm not sure it was marketed well, at least not in Australia. I never heard of it until I walked in and saw it on the shelf. So, I mean, I'm curious as well, because I definitely seen Spec Ops throughout the years in lots of different little places. I remember seeing it in stores and thinking it was a very generic, military-based shooter type of game. I don't know if it was advertised well or not, because I really didn't pay attention to that kind of stuff back then. I definitely pay more attention to it now, so I'm more conscious of it, but back then I really don't know how the advertising was. I'm curious too. Yeah, no, it was the movie game, the Spider-Man game. Alright, so the last section and segment that we have to discuss during this discussion, very good words, is what we can learn from Spec Ops. One of the most important things that I think we can learn from this game is that games don't have to be fun. There's a common misconception that games need to be a positive, joyous, happy experience, that they need to put you in a good mood afterwards, that you can walk away happy with the time that you spent playing that game and what happened when you played. But video games don't have to be that way. They actually have, in my opinion, a duty to create experiences that aren't fun. I mean, and I'm not saying all of them, but I think it is the duty of video games to occasionally create these experiences that aren't fun in the way that Spec Ops creates one. I believe the importance and significance of entertainment is it creates a sort of snapshot of society at the time of its creation. So partially because if it's being made, then that means it's significant to society in some way at the time of its creation. And partially because the decisions made when creating the content is a reflection on at least some of society's view at the time. So, the creation of these games, if there is something being made, it's usually because it's either significant or important to the developers, it's significant or important to society, that it's enough to have the money investment into making it in the first place. And of course, the developers will put some of their view or their opinions or their bias into creating it to show and reflect what certain parts of society view of whatever the subject matter is at the time. I think it's also important for a video game. This War of Mine was brilliant and gut-wrenching. Sounds familiar. I don't know what that is. Is that a movie or is that a game or a book? Going back to expand on why I think it is video games have a duty to create certain games that aren't fun. When it comes to watching a movie about serious matters, it can feel artificial or exaggerated. I think it's more prone to feel more artificial or exaggerated compared to video games. Something done up for the sake of a movie, I feel like is a thought that people tend to have more often with movies than they do with video games. And it's really easy for people to play down whatever's happening on screen as something that's just happening for the entertainment or the fact that it is on a movie screen. Video games as a medium forces the player to take part in the experience that's happening. When someone is responsible for their actions in the real world or a video game, it can make things feel a lot heavier and real and stick with the person a lot more than if they're just watching a movie about something that happens. Video games that focus more on the negative aspects of humanity and life force players to live through them firsthand can be such a potent tool at truly communicating the importance of whatever that subject matter could be. So I think that, people see something on television, they see something on movies, in movie theaters, they think it's Hollywoodified, they think it's hammed up for entertainment value just to get people talking about it. I think that's a much more common reaction when it comes to movies, whereas I think with video games, I think more often than not, because it's the player experiencing it firsthand, because they are the ones who are committing the action that has these results, it tends to stick with them more and have more of an impact. So that's why I think it is very, very important for games, more than other mediums, to create these experiences that aren't fun. To make them be aware of everything going on, that this game is absolutely going to be something that's going to stick with me longer, about the atrocities of war and what happens in war can have an impact on people. I haven't seen it myself, but I do remember when Passion of the Christ came out, a lot of people felt the same way about the awful things that happened to Mel Gibson portraying Jesus in that movie. In a very similar way, I think a lot of people wouldn't say The Passion of the Christ was a good movie or enjoyable movie, but a lot of people would definitely say it had an impact on their life because they watched it. And I think it's the same thing with video games. Just because it's not a fun video game or something they enjoyed watching does not necessarily mean they would, it's not something they should play or something that they would wish they could remove the experience from their head. This War of Mine is it's a survival game. Okay. I've not heard of that one. I'm going to leave that in the tab to look at later. Cool. Thank you, AFK. Certainly seems like the mark of a good title if you find yourself thinking about it days later. Absolutely. 100%. If something sticks in your head, it's because it's definitely struck a chord with you. So another thing that I think the industry can learn is that, unfortunately, groundbreaking doesn't always sell. People get bored easily and want the next big thing. Both players and publishers want the next big thing. Players because they get bored of the same thing over and over and want to try something new. Publishers because, well, I guess publishers probably don't get bored of the same thing over and over. If it still sells, I'm sure they don't give a shit. It's more about the case of wanting to try and find whatever that next gold mine is and be the first one to tap it. One way to do that is obviously is taking something that is big and popular at the time and tweaking it slightly enough that it stands out on its own, but draws other people in. So an example that I could think of would be Fall Guys, where you have the BR genre is incredibly popular. It's huge. It's all over the place. It's ubiquitous. Every game was putting in a BR, it seemed like, every 3 months. And then we have Fall Guys, which is a BR, but it's a take on a completely different genre, where it's a BR, but it's in a platformer type of genre. And that did very well because it was able to pull in potentially people from the BR market, as well as draw the attention of people who like platforming and anyone who could be in between, to have this new market that no one had really been a part of yet or created any content for. Unfortunately, making games is a very expensive thing, and publishers don't really like to take risks much, because if they don't pan out, it is, I mean, just money thrown down the hole. And that's kind of what happened to Spec Ops. Unfortunately, it is one of those examples. Military shooters were extremely popular at the time. It was clearly playing off of the genre of military shooters, but offered a unique twist on how the genre played out and the subject matter that it approached. But sadly, as we said before, it was outsold by a generic Spider-Man game and Lego Batman 2 within its first week of sales. Oh. It could have been because of poor advertising. I don't really know for sure. But as a whole, sadly, groundbreaking doesn't always work, despite the fact people want groundbreaking. Groundbreaking is new, unexplored territory and is trying something new. And if people don't know about it, or if people try it and it's just not something that really finds a niche or a market, unfortunately, it's money down the hole, and that could be a big deterrent for publishers to prevent them from really trying out new things. And the third and final thing I think we can really learn from Spec Ops: The Line is that video games are more than capable of handling hard topics. Games have long been fighting the stereotype that they're something for kids, children, and teenagers. There were plenty of games that put a focus on narrative before Spec Ops: The Line, but they were topics that I feel are more frequently explored. There are also topics that are understood and more freely talked about in society. Topics like corporate greed, a desire for revenge, a quest for power. And in a lot of these topics, they are topics that are usually, in some case, someone that's punching up. You know, you're not punching down, you're punching, you're fighting something that's bigger than you are. People who, with corporate greed, these are people who are already powerful and they want more. Same thing with a quest for power. Usually they're in a position to take what they have and try and expand it to have more power. People who have a quest for revenge, I feel like in most cases, are try to be reasoned with and tell them not to pursue this path, but they ignore it anyway. So you don't feel as bad necessarily for going and pursuing after them. Spec Ops, on the other hand, tackled a very serious topic that does happen in real life, a topic not tackled in video games, a topic that is not really discussed much in real life, really, for that matter, when it comes to PTSD and the horrors of war. It's definitely not a common topic. And it was pushing back against the comic trends in gaming at the time by, the common trend being military shooters and the glorification of war and what soldiers do, and pushing back against that and saying, you are not a fucking hero for doing this. It did all of this so wonderfully, and it also got people talking about the topic even more. But again, it was a very difficult topic, and it showed that video games are more than capable of doing this. It does not need to be unexplored territory. It does not need to be something that, movies and books need to approach first before they can think about doing it. Video games are as mature of a medium as any other medium if someone wants to do it. I believe that's everything I have to bring to the discussion about Spec Ops: The Line. Does anyone have anything that they want to contribute to the discussion to talk about before we wrap it up? I wonder if it existed a decade too early. Like if games like this came out in 2002, it would be more of a splash. I said this before. If this game was released today, I think it would be much more well received. I think between viral on, I mean, obviously the internet was still a place in 2012, but it was not as interconnected. It was not as ubiquitous. We didn't have nearly as common and strong and a strong force when it comes to social media, when it comes to advertising, when it comes to the video game industry. 8 years ago, 8 years is a long time. This game, I feel like if it got off on the wrong foot where it didn't sell very well at first, it could absolutely pick up later. I mean, we have Among Us for another example. Among Us came out, I think, 2 years ago. I was pretty much on the brink of just being like dropped entirely, and then fucking bam, out of nowhere, it is the biggest game on Twitch. There's 500,000 people watching it a day out of nowhere. It technically could happen with Spec Ops: The Line, but the main thing that comes with Spec Ops: The Line is the unexpected. going into it and going in and experiencing it, whereas it's definitely a more difficult thing to do now that it's been out so long and there's kind of been these trickles that people have heard about. If the game had come out today, I think it would have had better reviews because people understand that it's not, you know, the shooting mechanics not being as cutting edge or as groundbreaking or as interesting really is not a huge factor when clearly 85-90% of the game is made to tell a story. I think reviews would have been more positive, which would have gave it more positive buzz. I think if it came out now, there's more connection between people on social media and all these different pockets, all of the internet with Discord and Reddit. I think it would have been much easier for this game to come out, sell middling at first, and then people be like, yo, you gotta fucking pick this up, you gotta play this, I'm not gonna tell you why, just do it. There's Game Pass and all these other subscription services that could have launched on there and done fantastic. I think it definitely just at the time didn't hit the mark for a couple different reasons, and I think if it was released now it would do better. I agree. Or hate because of the bad depiction of soldiers? So I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, there's definitely a stronger sense of nationalism because of the stronger divide, because of the political climate right now. And it's definitely possible that this reception, this view of the American military being the bad guy in this case could have definitely angered a lot of people. But at the same time, you have just as many people who don't exactly view the military positively. So it could also be positively reviewed in that case. But at the same time, it's also the case that this, you know, the people, while they are bad guys, it is to show what happens in wartime and when deployed, and could create more strong sense of sympathy for people who had been in war when there's a lot of people who don't have as much sympathy toward people in the military for tons of different reasons. So it could have gone a ton of different ways, but unfortunately, we'll never know. I know it's a thing in movies, but is there a thing with military restrictions on what's portrayed in video games, making sure they're shown in positive light? Like how all movies have American soldiers that are strong, lawful, and just opposed to being realist? I don't think there's necessarily... What do you mean by restrictions, Trouble? Because I don't think there's, like, legal restrictions. I just think people don't want to do it. I don't think filmmakers want to do it. I don't think they want to be in a position where they can portray the American military as being monsters. Because it's going to get a shit ton of... This game got a shit ton of backlash when it came out. There was press coverage, and there was a lot of issues when this game came out. People saying that this was a horrible game, an anti-American game. I think that when it comes to movies and media, I don't think that they're necessarily not allowed to do it. It's just very risky. And this game was absolutely risky. Never seen the series here, and it came late, but dude, this is really interesting to watch. Oh, thank you. I love this series. It's also great because I had never played Spec Ops Online. And this series is great because it forces me to play a lot of very important landmark games in gaming, so I can speak about them from first-hand experience, but also because I get to research them and learn a lot about the history of the game. Next, we'll be doing Doom, the original Doom, which I've never played. Doesn't have to do with sponsorship? What do you mean sponsorship, Clyde? Yeah, I have a playlist. I upload all these discussions on YouTube. So if this was at all interesting, you can watch the other videos that I have on YouTube. We have had discussions on Metroid Prime, Bioshock 1, Bioshock 2, Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts Ukulele, Portal 1, Portal 2. This is episode 8. But I don't know. I mean, just my final thoughts on the game was this is great. I really wish I could have had my memory wiped of anything I knew about this game before I went into it. It's kind of a shame that I knew as much as I did about the game. Would have been much more impactful. But it was still it was a very strong experience that will definitely resonate and stick with me for a while. Like if they want to get military asses, you need to depict them in a certain way. I don't think so. I don't believe that's true. If you were to depict a certain person, probably, but I don't think you need, when it comes to military assets, I don't imagine those are something that are trademarked. I'm pretty sure when it comes to military outfits, when it comes to guns, when it comes to the name, the U.S. Army, the U.S. military, the U.S. Navy, I'm pretty sure you don't need to pay to use those. I'm pretty sure those are just public domain types of things. You can't, I don't think you can trademark the military or the Army. I remember hearing that before any movies that are about police and FBI personnel, it has to be really. I don't think that's true. Maybe it happened in the past, but I can't imagine that's true. I'd never heard about that. Let's Google that. Do you need... Does the FBI have to approve... At the FBI. Screenwriters, produce seeking... I guess if you want to get things like authenticated by the FBI, maybe? I don't know. I don't think so. I've never heard of that. That may be like an old-timey type of thing. But I haven't heard anything about that. Alright. I guess that will just about wrap up the discussion we have today for Spec Ops Online. Thank you everyone who was taking part in this and hung out for the discussion. These are always so much fun. Again, I'm so sorry this discussion took so long to get around to doing. Just a very hectic month and a very crazy game that was hard to get my thoughts organized on paper in the right way. This next video we will be doing will be Doom, the original Doom release. This is one of the games where I break the rule, where the majority of games in the Design and Play series will be focused on games released after the year 2000. However, Doom is a very significant release, just like Half-Life, and so I will be breaking that rule. The plan is to do Doom, the original release, as the next game, followed by Doom 2016. Those are the next two games that I plan on doing on stream. Because I have heard the Doom 2016 release. I have dipped my toes a little bit into some videos that talk about the development history of Doom 2016, and holy shit, that thing was apparently a mess. The game came out great, apparently, but apparently it was a shit show to get that game made. So I'm curious to dig into understanding more about that. But thank you everyone for watching. Hopefully you will watch the other videos in the playlist and let me know what you think. Any suggestions for future discussions, either about the quality of the layout or anything like that, please feel free to leave any feedback. You guys are fantastic. I guess that's pretty much it. You guys are great. Have a wonderful rest of your night. See ya.